Hi, I'm Kevin Gosztola. I'm the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. I was given a credential to cover the Julian Assange extradition hearing that is unfolding in London. And I've covered this case closely in some capacity since 2010, particularly when it involved the source, who is named Chelsea Manning. And that's where I enter this. That's how people know my work, because I covered the US military trial that took place when that unfolded. Julian Assange was the founder or co-founder of WikiLeaks, and he was the editor-in-chief for a number of years. WikiLeaks received over 500,000 documents from a US military soldier who was deployed to Baghdad, Iraq in 2010. And her name is Chelsea Manning. She provided information that revealed how the US military, the United States military, was pursuing wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It revealed numerous, over 250,000 US diplomatic cables. And there were also files on all of the men who were brought to the Guantanamo Bay military prison in Cuba. And then, very vividly, I don't want to leave this out, there was the collateral murder video, as they referred to it, that showed an Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad, where two Reuters journalists were gunned down while they were in the war zone. And then there is someone who is referred to as a good Samaritan, somebody who was coming to help them while they were wounded, and his van was shot by US soldiers. Reuters media organization tried to get a copy of this video, but they were denied it when they made the request. And there was no one who was ever held accountable. And this was what WikiLeaks described and Chelsea Manning described as a war crime that they exposed. And all of these disclosures, these leaks, put WikiLeaks on the map. They had been doing work since 2007, but it brought them into this realm where the US government was targeting them now because they were embarrassed by the disclosures. The prosecution of Assange involves 18 separate charges. 17 of them are violations of a law in the United States called the Espionage Act. But it's sort of a confusing name for the law because it does not necessarily have to involve, or the way that the United States Justice Department has been using the law gets away from its original intention. Julian Assange is not accused of giving secret documents to an enemy of the United States. He didn't pass this information on and engage in espionage as people in Brazil might understand espionage. He received documents and he published those documents just like every media organization in the world. And yet the United States is using this law in a way that has not been done before to prosecute a publisher. Typically, this law, the US Espionage Act, has in the last 20 years been used against federal or US government employees who were acting as whistleblowers and revealing information. They had never gone after someone like Julian Assange. There is another, and that's why press freedom groups around the world are concerned about what the US government is doing. That's why you're hearing alarms raised globally. The argument of the Assange defense is that he is being targeted in a political prosecution by President Donald Trump in the United States. And they very clearly make the point that what we are talking about in this case happened almost 10 years ago, and that the source, Chelsea Manning, who was accused of committing a crime, was prosecuted in a U.S. military trial, and she did receive a sentence and go to prison. But then they asked the question, why did President Barack Obama's administration decide not to also prosecute Julian Assange if he was engaging in crimes when he did this work with Chelsea Manning? And the answer is that they believed that if they prosecuted WikiLeaks, they would run into the same problems related to freedom of expression and freedom of the press and free speech rights that they would run up against if they prosecuted the New York Times, which is a very famous U.S. newspaper, or the Washington Post, a well-known U.S. newspaper. And those newspapers also published the documents from WikiLeaks, just like WikiLeaks did. So they would be violating U.S. law. If they went after WikiLeaks, they would have to turn around and go after the editors of those newspapers as well. And so the United States Justice Department decided in 2013, as reported by U.S. media, not to indict Julian Assange. But then when President Donald Trump came into office, he had people in his administration who felt differently about WikiLeaks, did not have the same respect for press freedom. And so Donald Trump's administration has taken this step because they see Julian Assange and WikiLeaks as a threat to the United States. And a second point to make about what the defense is trying to show is that they exposed alleged crimes that the United States government committed when pursuing wars and when detaining people. The documents exposed torture, they exposed CIA rendition, they exposed war crimes by the US military, and they exposed the way in which certain lies were being told about them who were being held at Guantanamo in order to justify keeping them in indefinite detention. The way that the defense is trying to show Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States is to try and prove that there's something called dual criminality that is happening here, and in essence, the person who is being pursued exposed crimes, and in retaliation, they are being treated like they are a criminal, and that there is a political reason behind bringing Julian Assange to the United States. So it is not a standard criminal case. It is one that is filled with politics. One aspect that I think people should be very concerned about is that the defense is also not only challenging a prosecution that threatens press freedom, but they're also challenging an espionage operation that was carried out against Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuador embassy. And so we see a lot in these cases that what can bring them down is when the people who are involved in prosecuting engage in acts that mean there is no way fair justice can be carried out. And so his lawyers argue that while he was in the embassy, there was a private security company named Undercover Global that spied on him while he was in the embassy, that spied on his visits with attorneys to a degree where he had to meet in the women's bathroom to try to hide from them. And that is a case that is in Spain right now. Julian Assange has filed a lawsuit and is arguing that this U.S. intelligence-backed operation happened against Julian Assange. And so this is a critical part of showing that, not only is it wrong to charge Julian Assange, but even if it's a crime to charge Julian Assange, you have lost the right to prosecute this case against Julian Assange because you violated his rights by spying on him while he was a asylum seeker, while he was in the embassy under protection, and should have had his rights respected. What could happen to Julian Assange if he's brought to the United States is that he could wait for several months in a prison or a jail cell. When he goes on trial in the United States, he will go on trial in a district that is very close to Washington, D.C. It's called the Eastern District of Virginia. And what's important for people around the world to understand is this is where people who work for U.S. intelligence agencies, the military, and government agencies live. And that is where they will draw people who can be part of the jury. That's where people who would review and hear the case and decide if Julian Assange committed a crime would come from. And that is why many people who are following this feel like if he is brought to trial, it will be very hard for his defense to prove that he did not do something wrong, because many of the people who are hearing already have a bias, or they're likely to be opposed to Julian Assange and what he did. They doubt that there would be fair justice if Julian Assange was brought to trial. If he is convicted under these charges, then he would go to a prison and he would likely be in very, very restrictive conditions. He could serve a lengthy sentence. And again, there could be inhumane treatment that he suffers while he is in a U.S. prison, and it would affect his health. We have heard many pieces of evidence about Julian Assange and how his physical health and his mental health are deteriorating, and that he has been significantly affected.
Obama é uma prisão de segurança máxima. É mais para gente que tinha matado alguém, terroristas, não geralmente para pessoas que estão esperando o processo ainda. Parece que a saúde dele não é boa. Ele perdeu muito peso. Eu acho que as condições agora são parecidas ao confinamento solitário. Eu acho que são a maioria dos dias, eu acho 23 horas por dia só, mas é difícil ter informações porque realmente não teve visitas nos últimos meses por causa do COVID.
I remind people that he entered the Ecuador embassy in London in 2012, and he was in that embassy until 2019, exposed to very little sunlight. He was not able to go anywhere. The U.S. media believes that this case, by and large, is inappropriate for the U.S. Justice Department to pursue against Julian Assange. The editors of these organizations have written pieces that say that this would pose a risk to journalism in the United States. And I think they even acknowledge that it would pose a risk to journalism around the world for people who want to do their work. However, they have not covered it as intensively as other media organizations, perhaps in the United Kingdom, parts of Europe. I think it's fair to say that there has been possibly more interest in South America than in the United States. And part of that has to do with some of the people who work for U.S. media believing that Julian Assange isn't really a journalist and that he is something different than what they do. They don't like him. They believe that he is maybe more of an activist, or they buy into some of the arguments that the United States government makes against him, where they claim that he is more of a hacker than a journalist. And that definitely plays into what the prosecution is trying to do here. And I think that I do think that they make a mistake by not following this case more intensively in the US. What is happening with Julian Assange can be put into the context of this war on journalism in the United States. His legal team has tried to do that with the start of the extradition proceedings, or the start of the extradition trial against Julian Assange in London. They had witnesses come and talk about what the state of journalism is under Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as a leader of the United States, has used his own presidential Twitter account to attack journalists. There are groups in the United States that have followed it closely and found that over 2,000 times he has attacked journalists and sometimes even singled them out as enemies of the people. They have gone above and beyond to make it seem like many of us in the profession of journalism are spreading lies to citizens and trying to bring down Donald Trump and the government. And that has created, I think, this climate and atmosphere where they are motivated to go after Julian Assange because they are not defenders of freedom of the press. They are on the opposite side of allowing this kind of open discussion and freedom of expression that many people around the world support. On one hand, I would say it's important to everyone around the world because the entire world benefited from seeing the contents of the documents that WikiLeaks took risks to publish. The US diplomatic cables, for example, contain details on almost every single country in the world that the US has any relationship with. And it showed what those governments in those countries were hiding from their people. And that was the way it was. That was the case in Latin America. That was the case in the African continent, in Asia and Europe, in Australia, where Julian Assange is from. Everyone learned something about what their government was hiding, especially when it came to their work behind the scenes with the US government. I think they should also be concerned about this. Anyone around the world should be concerned because Julian Assange is not an American citizen. And so it is alarming to an even greater extent that the US government is claiming the authority to go after Julian Assange because they are trying to say that an international publisher or a journalist should have to follow US secrecy laws or regulations. But Julian Assange never signed an agreement to protect US classified information. And so essentially that opens the door for a future where the US government may decide that if they're successful in convicting Julian Assange of a crime, that then they would go after journalists in Brazil, or maybe they would go after journalists in some part of the Middle East who get documents on US wars and activities by the United States. Or maybe they would go after a journalist in South Africa. Who knows what would stop them? It also may embolden other powerful countries to take the same step. And you may see a degrading of press freedom around the world. I believe that would be a really bad development for the world. And so I think if you are from anywhere in the world, you want to oppose what the United States is doing so that we don't have a future where countries are prosecuting international journalists based on the basis that they have government secrets. If Julian Assange is going to beat this extradition case, it is going to be because people from around the world oppose what the US government is doing. It is going to be because journalists at media organizations recognize the threat from the US government because of this prosecution. It will be a result of human rights organizations, press freedom organizations, groups like Amnesty International that have a reputation around the world for coming to the defense of people when they are targeted in this manner by governments. It is going to be because everyone recognizes that this is a problem. It will take people opposing the United Kingdom, their government, and the decision to allow the United States to pursue Julian Assange and his extradition to the United States. There's going to be a lot of pressure that is necessary because, frankly, the judge who is reviewing this case does not have a very good record of standing up to anyone when there is a request for extradition. She has approved 96% of the extraditions that have come across or have come through her court. And when she's been in a position to approve an extradition, 96% of the time she has approved extraditions. And so it doesn't look that good for the defense. However, they have appeals that they will be able to pursue, and they'll be able to argue that there were abuses of the process and that due process rights or Julian Assange's human rights were violated in the course of the extradition case. They'll be able to make those arguments. His legal team can do that to try to block his extradition. I think it's possible that they could succeed in higher courts after this stage of the case. And there may be a political shift that happens in the United States. There is a presidential election happening currently in 2020. There is Vice President Joe Biden, who is challenging Donald Trump for the presidency. There isn't a lot on the record from him in opposition to what Donald Trump is doing against Julian Assange. So I go back to, it is going to take people around the world engaging in protest in order for this to be stopped.